Welcome to Saving Lives podcast, or I guess this could be a video podcast. I'm Eddyjoe. For those who don't know me, I am an intensive care physician. I've been on the front lines of all this nonsense that we've been dealing with for over a year and a half now since it all started. And I like to review evidence-based stuff using evidence-based practices and giving citations for everything I say. So today I'm going to be discussing, and pardon me if I stumble over this word, but this pharmaceutical is called Molnupiravir. And yesterday, which was the 1st of October of 2021 for historical context, there was quite a bit of a stir after this press release. And again, this is not a peer-reviewed journal or anything like that, but it was a press release by Merck Pharmaceuticals after reports that their new antiviral medication, which is called Molnupiravir, showed benefits in early COVID-19. In this particular video, in this podcast, which if something new comes out, I'll go back and try to update it once we get the formal data. I'm going to be discussing what was said in that podcast and what that actually means. So again, for now, all we have is this press release. I'm not going to go over what was said in the media because quite frankly, I don't trust the media. I have no issue saying that out loud. But the commentary I will say is that I can't help but get somewhat excited whenever there's a therapy that could potentially keep people out of the intensive care unit. As an intensive care doctor, I know that once people come into my ICU, the chances of them being the same and actually going home are pretty slim despite my best efforts and my best therapies. Therefore, I'm a fan of whatever therapy will keep patients out of the intensive care unit and out of the hospital. And this is what this is designed for. The first question we all have is, what is Molnupiravir? And this is, and I'm going to quote what they say, it is a, quote, orally administered form of a potent ribonucleoside analog that inhibits the replication of SARS-CoV-2, being the virus. COVID-19 is the syndrome, the actual virus is SARS-CoV-2. And it's pretty funny to me that they actually announced this press release at 6 a.m. on the 1st of October, which is yesterday for historical context. The reason why I think this is kind of funny is because pre-market trading, for those of us who are investors, kind of gets rolling at that time, and that sent the stock on a frenzy. The headline of the actual, and that's as an aside, not a medical thing, but the actual headline states that, quote, Merck and Ridgeback's investigational oral antiviral Molnupiravir reduced the risk of hospitalization or death by approximately 50% compared to placebo for patients with mild or moderate COVID-19. So I'm going to break this apart because the headline is that it reduced the risk of hospitalization or death by approximately 50%. But we have to think about what this really means, and that's part of what I'm going to go over in this video. The second half of it is that it was an interim analysis of a phase 3 study, and I'll go over that in a second. The main headline thereafter is that, quote, at the interim analysis, 7.3% of patients who received Molnupiravir were hospitalized through day 29, compared to 14.1% of placebo-treated patients who were hospitalized or died. So again, if you got the medication, 7.3% chance that you're going to end up in the hospital or dying. Well, actually nobody died in that group, so ended up in the hospital. Versus 14.1% of patients who were treated with the placebo ended up going to the hospital and or dying. So the p-value, which is something that we look at in statistics to figure out if this is actually worth anything, was tiny at 0.0012, which bodes well for this medication. Anything less than 0.05 is something we consider to be statistically significant and important. So what do these numbers mean? Well, first of all, this is not a cure for COVID-19. It does keep patients out of the hospital though. There is a particular calculation that many of us do who know how to read articles, and you can start doing this yourself if you want to go down this rabbit hole, which is to calculate the number needed to treat. So the number needed to treat is the number of patients needed to treat to show a benefit. And if you go ahead and you plug in the numbers in your number needed to treat calculator, in other words, and you could Google this is accessible to everybody. So you put 7.3% in one box, you put the 14.1% in the other, you'll see that the number needed to treat to keep a single patient out of the hospital is 14.7. Again, this is not a cure for COVID-19, but it helps. It's higher. I wish it was 6, but this helps, and I'm going to go back to what this means for the cost of this medication later on in this particular video. I've taken issue with this before because the headline states that Molnupiravir reduced the risk of hospitalization or death by approximately 50%. But that, you hear 50%, you're like, yeah, this is awesome. But this also means that approximately 14 patients that you give this to, it's not going to help keep them out of the hospital. But again, that doesn't really sound as sexy, and that's why it's not stated that way. It won't grab the headlines, but overall it still helps. It's also important to note that there were 0 deaths in the Molnupiravir group and 8 deaths in the control group. And of course, saving lives is very, very important. We don't want anybody to die from this awful virus. But one of the things that we need to look at is that there was a 0% incidence of death in the in the group that got Molnupiravir, but the incidence of death was 2.1% in patients with at least one risk factor of poor outcome. So this means patients who are greater than or equal to 60, patients with diabetes, and patients with obesity amongst the group. We have to wait for the formal publication to see what was the whole spectrum of what they considered people who were at high risk to actually have. So this clinical trial is called the Move Out trial, and again, it was a phase 3 trial, which means it's almost ready to get the green light. Phase 1 is usually when they make sure it doesn't kill anybody. Phase 2 is when they try it on a larger group of people. And again, this is me just speaking off the cuff. There's way more to it than what I'm explaining right there. But phase 2 is that they give it to a larger group of people, make sure it's safe, make sure that they could at least tease out that it's going to have some benefit. And phase 3 is the biggest trial, usually speaking. But this press release came from the interim analysis, which means that the full trial is not yet complete and accessible for us to read. And what is an interim analysis, you might ask? Well, this is when a study is being conducted, when you're like sitting down with your group of people, you start pre-specifying your endpoints as to when you're going to start looking at the data, kind of like at a halfway point, to see if either you're having a benefit with the particular intervention that you're trying, if you are seeing harm, or if it's pretty much pointless and there's futility in the trial and you just need to like stop it at that point. But even though the full trial is not yet complete, per the press release, quote, recruitment into the study is being stopped early due to these positive results. And this was a decision made by both the FDA and an independent data monitoring committee. For those of us who are taking care of these patients, hopefully this means that the manuscript, in other words, what we could actually read to see if these data are actually legit or not, it'll be knocked out shortly for us to be able to dissect. But in this interim analysis, they included 775 patients, but they also specified that they already recruited 90% of the 1,550 patients that they wanted to have planned. So what they did for these patients is that they started them on either Molnupiravir or a placebo within 5 days of them having symptoms. This means that they started these patients early. And to me, this is of utmost importance because it is my opinion that the earlier you start on therapy, whether it's Molnupiravir, whether it's any other therapy that I'm not going to discuss in this video, but I'm sure comments are going to show up about in the comment section. Once you start early, it's a better outcome, and chances that they're going to end up in my ICU are less and therefore better. So I don't want to see anybody in my ICU with COVID-19. So the formal inclusion criteria state that, quote, patients had an initial onset of signs or symptoms attributable to COVID-19 for less than or equal to 5 days prior to the day of randomization, and at least one of the following signs or symptoms attributable to COVID-19 on the day of randomizations. In other words, these patients still needed to be actively sick. One of the things that I appreciate about this study is that they included patients who had at least one risk factor associated with poor disease outcomes. And again, those risk factors included obesity, an age greater than or equal to 60 years of age, diabetes, and heart disease. One of the things they did not specify at all, that hopefully is going to be listed in the manuscript, is whether or not these patients were vaccinated, or some of them were. It's honestly a remarkable international study, meaning that the patient population is not heterogeneous. excuse me, it's not homogeneous, it's heterogeneous. There's a lot of different people from different areas. Let me put this on mute, sorry about that. But the study actually started in October of 2020. And for historical context, in October of 2020, we did not have the vaccines available to the lay public at that time. If you care to see what the exact inclusion and exclusion criteria were for this study, you should check it out in the show notes where I have linked the stuff to clinicaltrials.gov, which is where this study was actually registered. Of the exclusion criteria, the bulk of exclusions include patients with poor renal function, certain HIV patients, and patients with liver dysfunctions such as transaminitis, patients with hepatocellular carcinoma, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and I definitely recommend you read those yourself. So the next question is, should Molnupiravir actually work against the variants? Because many of us are battling the Delta variant right now. And the Move Out trial has actually looked into the variants, and they state, quote, to date, the Delta, Gamma, and Mu variants have accounted for nearly 80% of the evaluable cases in the trial. So we will have to wait for the actual subgroup analysis when the formal publication is published, when the formal manuscript is published. Sorry for that unnecessary redundancy. But there we'll learn the actual details of this. One of the questions that I have with any medication, anything I try to give to my patients, is what adverse effects could I expect? And the reality is that there was no difference in the incidence of adverse effects between the Molnupiravir group and the placebo groups. There was also no differences in the incidence of drug-related adverse effects. During clinical trials, patients sometimes drop out of the trial and stop either taking the placebo or the study drug. And the curious thing that happened here is that in the control arm, meaning the people who did not get the Molnupiravir, 3.4% of those patients dropped out of the study and stopped taking the drug, versus in the actual experimental arm, the Molnupiravir arm, 1.3% of patients dropped out of the study. So that was pretty interesting as an aside. The next question I ask myself with regards to Molnupiravir is this potentially going to work in our hospitalized patients? The following is not evidence-based, it's just my opinion, but I think that this is not going to work at all in hospitalized patients. The reason why is because this medication is an antiviral drug. It's supposed to stop replication of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. That's why you need to give it early. Once a patient comes to the hospital, they've usually been lingering around at home with symptoms, just feeling crummy malaise, fever, etc. Some cough here and there for about 7 days. And that's when they start having the real shortness of breath that leads them to come into the hospital. And that's when they find that they have the COVID-19 related pneumonia and ARDS and all that cascade that eventually ends up with the patient, unfortunately, ending up in my hands. But once the patient goes into this whole cytokine storm / inflammatory cascade, it's not a viral replication issue. It's more so inflammation snowball that we try really hard to stop it from happening by giving the patient steroids and monoclonal antibodies and Janus kinase 1/2 inhibitors, etc., etc. But I think that even the people who came up with this drug actually figured that out, because once I was doing all my homework on clinicaltrials.gov to investigate what trial they were doing and what the inclusion-exclusion criteria, I found that they actually looked at this in hospitalized patients and they terminated that particular study. So I guess that they weren't seeing any benefit whatsoever there. And if you want to check that out, go to my website because I have links to that. The next question is, where do we go next from here now that we have this press release? Well, I honestly suspect that there's going to be an emergency use authorization for this therapy and a frenzy to try to get it into the hands of patients. The press release states that, quote, Merck expects to produce 10 million courses of therapy, 10 million, by the end of 2021. I guess they must have suspected that this was going to work because they entered, quote, Merck entered into a procurement agreement with the US government under which Merck will supply approximately 1.7 million courses of Molnupiravir to the US government, end quote. Well, will other countries be able to get the benefits of this, the possible benefits of this medication? And they state in the press release that Merck Pharmaceuticals has come into an agreement with generic manufacturers to be able to get this to different countries that are not the United States. But as an intensive care doctor and somebody who appraises literature, and honestly, I'm trying to figure out whatever I could do to better take care of my patients, what am I waiting for with regards to this therapy and this trial? Well, the first thing is, before I get excited about anything, I want to read the actual paper. I don't believe that medicine by press release is the way to go. I want to see the groups of patients to whom this was provided. I want to see if there were any adverse effects. I know that they said that there was no adverse effects, but I want to see what adverse effects were listed. I don't trust the press release. I also want to see if there was a subgroup of people who may have been vaccinated. I want to see when they started, if they're able to break down the 700 or so people who were enrolled into the trial, break down to see in whom is this going to benefit the most. See if we could bring that number needed to treat down from 14.7 down to something a little bit more reasonable. And in addition to that, I want to see the demographics of the folks who ended up in the hospital despite this therapy. Also, seeing if this helps shorten symptoms would be helpful, although I'm going to be selfish here. I don't really care if somebody has symptoms for 5 days or 7 days. As an ICU doctor, I just do not want them in my ICU. But that's that. The next question is, how much does this all cost? Because I know that cost is something that we're not thinking about very much these days, but we need to think about it. This is important. I didn't give too much effort into looking at the cost because it was readily available on the major news sources, and it states that this costs about 700 of our tax dollars, or money printed out of thin air, if you understand the Federal Reserve and our monetary policy and fiat currency and all that, but $700 per regimen. So if we do some math and we find that the number needed to treat to keep a patient out of the hospital is 14 times $700 is $9,800 to keep a person out of the hospital. So the question I pose to you is this worth it? But I'll leave it up to you to decide, and I bet I'm gonna have a lot of conversation in the comments section where people are going to be debating this versus other therapies that could be used to keep people out of the hospital. But nonetheless, I greatly appreciate your support and sticking through with my video all the way to the end, and I hope this brings you some sort of benefit and helps you understand this therapy more and why you should get excited about it or not get excited about it, depending on I'll let you make up your own mind about all this. Hope you all have a great day. Thanks a lot for your support. Bye.